All right, welcome back, everyone. So, some interesting stories to go into. It seems that Jack Dorsey, now, of course, the CEO of Twitter, is talking about coming hyperinflation here in the United States, something we've been talking about for a while, but he's saying it's pretty much happening now. Also, folks, there's been some new and disturbing stuff, newly released documents obtained by Judicial Watch, which again files FOIA requests suing for government documents. They got documents from the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, looking into this experiments they're doing on humanized mice. One of the big stories that was coming out with this COVID research they were doing in China, including stuff financed by the United States, is they were testing it on mice that had humanized lungs. A big question is, how do they make these humanized mice? Well, the discovery of how they do it, I think, is so disturbing that even some of the folks at Judicial Watch say it's some of the most disturbing stuff they've ever seen. Basically, the FDA has been purchasing parts from aborted children, aborted fetuses, if you want to call them that, including heads and other parts. And the information is now showing the type of research that the FDA had been doing on this. Apparently, this research had been canceled by Donald Trump when Trump was still in office. It has allegedly been renewed by Biden. I'll be detailing this, a few other stories. Also, folks, quick update on this whole issue of the Attorney General in the United States allegedly calling for investigations into parents. Again, you might remember there was this big school board, one of the largest in the country, that wanted the government to investigate parents for possible domestic terrorism. If the parents were, for example, threatening making threats during school meetings, or, for example, being even not terrorism, as they would call it, just annoying them, essentially, i.e. criticizing them about critical race theory, criticizing them about vaccine narratives, and so on. Well, folks, it looks like both the Biden administration, the Attorney General, and the school board have apologized, and I'll be detailing that as well. Folks, a lot to go into tonight. Always a lot to talk about. That said, it's great seeing you all here today. It's disturbing stuff. I apologize for the harshness of the news sometimes, but what are you going to do, you know? We got to talk about it. It's dark stuff sometimes, but you got to talk about it. Yeah, hey, Smiley Chris, I appreciate it. He said, you the man. Yeah, Stephen Uhi said, what a joke. We want our kids. Yeah, well, that's what a lot of parents are saying. Is it when was it ever the case that parents could not have an issue with what's being taught to their kids? How can parents not have an issue with what's being forced on their children in schools, the public school system? You know, the nature of the school system has changed quite a bit. In fact, the Department of Education is actually a very new department. Really, it's not that old. And one of the big concerns parents have is that they're losing control of their children because the government seems to be interested in taking it away from them. I could go into a whole big story about the origins of that and so on, but maybe not for tonight. Maybe one of these days we'll do something on it. Yeah, concerned citizen. He said criticism is now an act of terror, and actually that's an important point. That ties into something I want to talk about as well, which is, well, you might remember the last episode. We talked about how Trump has now announced a new social network. It's going to be called Truth Social. Interestingly, as well, Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, is coming out and announcing a rebranding of Facebook on this whole metaverse concept, a virtual reality system where you can immerse yourself in essentially a virtual world where you can do things like have meetings or attend your job, office environment, or, for example, purchase things and so on. The internet's going in two starkly different directions, one of which is free and one of which is not free. But there's an interesting point to get to this, which is, as you just mentioned, discourse is coming about again. Criticism is coming about again. And when the average citizen once again has a platform on which to criticize things the government is doing, things the school boards are doing, things that are happening in the country they don't agree with, that pressure actually does change things. We see now, even with the amount of censorship people are under, even with the amount of pressure people are under, that you have lawsuits, you have parents pushing back, you have people speaking out. And even if the voices are not heard on a larger scale, it is having an impact. Now, imagine what's going to happen once their voices are able to be heard on a larger scale. That is the big significance, I think, of the potential, at least, and we'll see if it does work out, but the potential, at least, of having a functioning and very large social network that is uncensored, relatively. At least allows for free speech and discourse. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first story for the night. I want to talk about hyperinflation because, well, those of you who've been watching the show for a while, well, we've been talking about it for a while, and it's been a long way coming. And, folks, it does appear to be the case that now it's here. Now, first of all, I'm going to talk about Jack Dorsey's saying. It says here, Twitter and Square CEO Jack Dorsey says hyperinflation will happen soon in the U.S. and the world. And it says here, Twitter co-founder Jack Dorsey weighed in on escalating inflation in the U.S., saying things are going to get considerably worse. Get ready for it. This is a quote from him, a tweet. He said, hyperinflation is going to change everything. It's happening. The tweet comes with consumer price inflation running near a 30-year high in the United States and growing concern that the problem could be worse than policymakers have anticipated. In other words, they're saying it's going to be bad. Folks, it's probably going to be worse than what they're saying. It's the concern. Now, on Friday, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, which is neither federal nor a reserve, I should note, acknowledged that inflation pressures are likely to last longer than previously expected, noting that they could run well into next year. The central bank leader added that he expects the Fed, the Federal Reserve, to soon begin pulling back on the extraordinary measures it has provided to help the economy that critics say have stoked the inflation run. Like mass printing money, for example. Maybe they'll stop mass printing money, which does tend to cause inflation, which, well, frankly, they've been doing for a while now. Folks, I want to go a bit more into this in terms of what's happening, but I should mention again that, well, speaking of finances, we are still demonetized by YouTube, but luckily we do have sponsors, and tonight's episode is brought to you by Secure. Over 155 million Americans were affected by data leaks in 2020. The average American had their personal data stolen about 4 times over the past year. People get anxious when they can't protect their online data or online activity. But now there's a new email and social messaging app called Secure. That's Secur. They can give privacy and security for sending emails and messages. Secure's server and data center are hosted in Switzerland. That's because Switzerland has the strictest data privacy laws in the world. Secure is also the only private and secure messaging and email app that does not rely on big tech companies like Amazon, Google, or Microsoft. And because of that, it's also not subject to the Intrusive Cloud Act, let alone monitoring potentially from those companies as well. Now, Secure does not ask for your phone number, does not mine your data, does not upload your contacts, like all other applications of this type tend to do. Also, Secure Messenger functions by adding people you know and then adding the secure numbers. You can still chat with users who do not have Secure just by sending them an invite. And in this way, you're protected from hackers getting into your phone. You have full privacy while on the app as well. Now, it's only $5 for the Messenger and $10 for the email and Messenger package. You can visit secure.com today. That's Sekur.com today for a free 7-day trial, or you can use the promo code Joshua to get 25% off. And big thanks out to Secure for sponsoring tonight's episode. And folks, again, just mentioning, if you do have questions, leave them in the chat. We'll try to get to them around the halfway point. But first, I want to go a bit more to what's happening with, well, the warnings of hyperinflation. Now, Jack Dorsey, the CEO of Twitter, is saying that it's here already. Essentially, we're already going to be experiencing it. It's already started. Frankly, we're already at a 30-year high, as we just mentioned. And we were talking about the many issues impacting this, such as the electricity crisis, which isn't being talked about by many people, happening, for example, in China and other countries, major exporters and manufacturers for the United States and other countries. When we're talking about the supply chain choke points getting cut off, essentially, and something that they're trying to solve right now and not doing a very good job at, because basically you need to exceed the breadth of the issue or the issue is going to continually get worse. You have issues with truck drivers, issues with people being out of work because of COVID, people getting fired because of COVID, additional lockdown measures, meaning that there's less money circulating in the economy in general, let alone many other issues, each of which has been, I think, stoked to a different degree by the different bad government policies here in the United States and around the world. Folks, it doesn't look like there's an end to it in sight just yet. But the Treasury Secretary is clarifying and saying the opposite of what Jack Dorsey is saying that the United States is not losing control over inflation. Now, it says here, Twitter CEO Jack Dorsey, again, as we mentioned, issued a warning about rising inflation over the weekend, as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen on Sunday said the United States is not losing control. And this is a quote from her. She said, "I don't think we're about to lose control of inflation. On a 12-month basis, the inflation rate will remain high into next year because of what's already happened. But I expect improvements by the middle to end of next year, second half of next year." In other words, they're saying it's totally under control, but it's going to get really bad until like halfway through 2022. Interestingly, going into the midterm elections, very likely, which means that the image of, well, poor finances could impact the voting turnout for the Democrats, given that they're the supermajority right now. Not something they would want, I would assume, but we'll see how it goes. Oh, the tea tonight, by the way, is ginseng tea with honey. I was wondering. Now, on that note, the Federal Reserve is also coming out and really contradicting what Janet Yellen is saying, contradicting what the Treasury Secretary is saying over whether they actually do have the situation under control, unless they're, controlling it in a very bad direction. Maybe they do have it under control, but that means they're controlling it and it's heading in a very bad direction. And maybe that's what she means by it. But folks, the Federal Reserve is right now saying that businesses say vaccine mandates are hurting employment. And keep in mind that the president himself currently, Joe Biden, is saying that pretty much the mandates are not going to end. This was a recent quote we talked about from, not the exact quote. But he says basically until we reach like 98%, maybe even total, they've talked about vaccination in the United States. Folks, it's not going to happen. I guarantee you there are a lot of Americans who will never get vaccinated because it goes against their principles. They'd rather be thrown in prison than get vaccinated because it violates their religion, violates their principles, violates their views on the powers of government, and a lot of them are just not going to do it. And even then, Biden is clarifying that even if you reach 98% vaccination, it only might lift. The restrictions might lift, not that they will. And he said, I believe the quote was, "I am not the scientist." That was the way he framed it, by the way. In other words, the issues we're having that are hurting employment and hurting the economy, they're not going to be ending them, at least according to what they're saying. In addition to that as well, you even had Pete Buttigieg, the transportation secretary, I believe, coming out just recently and saying that even the supply chain issue is not going to end, not only until the United States pretty much ends all the different standards they have in place with the vaccine mandates and so on, which are impacting transit, impacting truck drivers, impacting everything, but globally. And so until the entire world, essentially, as he is himself is saying, until the entire world ends their lockdown policies, ends their mandate policies or whatever else, until that happens and they stop putting pressure on the supply chain issues are not going to go away. Now, the Federal Reserve itself now is saying that businesses are saying the vaccine mandates are hurting their own employment. And it says here, the Federal Reserve on Thursday said that businesses have reported COVID-19 vaccine mandates have hurt employment and are contributing to labor supply problems, even before President Joe Biden's previously announced vaccine mandate for private businesses goes into effect, which I should note it still has not. Now, this is a quote from the report. It says transportation and technology firms say particularly low labor supply, while many retail, hospitality, and manufacturing firms cut hours or production because they did not have enough workers. Not that there's not enough demand for the products, there's not enough workers. And keep in mind, folks, they were giving unemployment to people on a large scale during the lockdowns and so on. A lot of people found that they make more money staying at home and not working at all than they do going to work because the government was giving out so much money. They also had the rent moratorium where people didn't have to pay rent if they didn't want to. Take into account that just because people are staying home doesn't mean they don't have their basic needs still. They still need food. They still need basic services. They still probably need luxury items. Now, what happens when you have people who are not working and the businesses that keep the cogs of society running essentially, but they're still demanding the fruits of the labor of the different cogs of society, so to speak, while you have a supply chain issue. You have the issue, again, that businesses are not able to fill roles that need to be filled in order to keep things working. Essentially, these policies destroyed the basic functions of our society, at least temporarily. We'll see how it goes. And now we're seeing the impact of that. Now, it says here, I mentioned that they're saying that different companies are seeing the impact of it, right? Because they don't have enough workers. And it continues stating firms reported higher turnover as workers left for other jobs or retired. Childcare issues and vaccine mandates were widely cited as contributing to the problem, along with COVID-related absences. Keep in mind as well that because a lot of kids had to stay home because of the vaccine mandates or policies or whatever else, you actually, I believe it's 11% of Americans now are homeschooling kids. In terms of the kids who are being homeschooled, about 11%. That policy made it so that one parent typically had to stay home with the kids and basically homeschool them, even though it's, logging onto Zoom or Skype or whatever they're using in the classroom. Meaning that one working parent had to work from home, even if they did not want to. This is, again, a factor, especially as they were offering different benefits, unemployment, or having work at home programs for the businesses they're in. All of these things are compounding, and we're starting to feel now the impacts of these different policies. Now, the trajectory of this is actually hard to predict. The trajectory of it's hard to predict because we haven't really seen anything like it. There are two potential questions that should be asked, though. Is it being done intentionally, or is it being done unintentionally? Now, typically, we would assume that things are done unintentionally. We would assume that the destruction of the economy, the lockdowns, the putting people out of business, the destroying of the retail industries and the luxury good industries, and ironically, even while destroying restaurants and mom and pop shops and even mid-level businesses, you have businesses like the big ones like Amazon and so on that are growing exponentially. You have internet companies growing exponentially, and you have people who run these companies buying up more and more parts of our society, like Bill Gates, for example, buying up farming land and so on. Now, that is the unintentional idea, that essentially what these different officials are doing is destroying essentially the free market, or at least the free market that we are able to participate in, the small and mid-level businesses, while basically helping the big businesses. That's the unintentional narrative. The other part is, well, maybe the other question would be, well, if it's not unintentional, is it intentional, frankly? And there's a case for that as well, because they've talked about it publicly. The idea of this great reset, the World Economic Forum, it sounds like conspiracy. They're talking about it, folks. Look it up. World Economic Forum is talking about it. The Biden administration's slogan of "Build Back Better," the whole idea that, even Pelosi herself saying that was it never let a good crisis go to waste. The Chinese Communist Party, in its own words, saying this is like a World War III scenario. And in their own words, they're saying within crisis lies opportunity. It seems to be the case that everybody is anticipating essentially a social collapse in some regard, and that from that collapse, they can essentially restructure society. This isn't to say they're doing it all intentionally. We can't prove that. But they have been talking about it, frankly, which does make things very bizarre. Now, If you understand it even from the unintentional standpoint in the way of taking advantage of a crisis, that's where you get into things like Hegelian dialectics, thesis, antithesis, synthesis. How do you observe a process in motion? There's something happening, an incident is taking place in society, and how do you how do you subvert that process to make sure that the outcome serves your interest rather than the original potential outcome? In other words, it has a trajectory. Let's say the outcome is heading in this way, but through your intervention, you want to make it go this way. You're taking a process in motion and changing the trajectory to suit your needs. That is essentially the way that a lot of this is old philosophy. This is again Hegelian dialectics, pre-Marx type stuff, which does play a big role in terms of how a lot of people strategically view crisis. Now, again, two questions: intentional, unintentional, and even if unintentional, it does seem to be the case that they are talking publicly about how to manipulate this crisis to serve their own interests. Some things to consider, and we'll see where we're heading with this. Now, if we get into I won't go too deep into this, not tonight at least, but if you get into the origins of the technocratic ideas, technocrats being a theory within the early 1930s, ironically, things like what we're seeing now with big tech essentially dominating a lot of the country, it was closely tied to fascism and these things, but it was a big theory in the United States in the early 1900s. Part of the goal of technocracy, which ironically if you read by the book, we're technically living in a technocracy with social media and online meetings and online stores like Amazon dominating essentially most of society, and even being able to essentially regulate our rights as they see fit, to the point where the government itself is even working directly with companies like Facebook and Twitter in order to encourage them to censor us, because private business is not held to the same laws as, let's say, a government would be. Essentially, we're living under the steel fist, the big boot of big business. The idea of technocracy was the service-based economy, the service-based society where people essentially own nothing. And everything is based on a rental service. Everything in your home is a rental. You don't own anything. They eliminate private property. It was a socialist idea, manipulating the idea of the free market. If you get into the ideas of what the World Economic Forum is talking about, they're actually talking about this stuff, which is a bit concerning, especially if you understand the origins of these types of concepts. They are talking about this stuff that, I believe the exact phrase or close to it is, they will own nothing and they will be happy. Anyways, we'll see how it goes. It does seem to be the case that they're trying to do this, but folks, oftentimes what you'll find is that the best laid plans of mice and men often go awry. And interestingly, that has been kind of the Trump effect, which is why I think a lot of them don't like him so much. Trump has a way of using the Hegelian dialectic concept, as we discussed, against them, where they can have a perfectly run plan. And he did this a lot when he was president. They can have a perfectly run plan. Everything's heading in their direction, dominating the narrative. And he just comes in from left field and just offsets the entire thing. If he really does move ahead with this platform he's talking about, this media and technology business, he's going to implode that, because this entire idea of a service-based economy and essentially big tech, syndicalism, whatever you want to call it, essentially running society. If Trump becomes the media mogul and the technocracy mogul, which his company, again, it's Trump Technology and Media Group, TMTG, which he's announced already, a social media, a Netflix-like platform, video on demand service, and also a media organization and a technology company. He might come in out of left field and essentially build what they're trying to build and beat them in the free market, which is an interesting concept. We'll see if he does it, but he has a weird way of doing this, to the extent that I wonder sometimes whether he's doing it knowingly or he just seems to have really good timing with such things. Anyways, folks. Again, if you have questions, leave them in the chat. Around the halfway point, we'll get to them. But I want to go into a few more stories first. Now, you have to forgive me, the story's a little disturbing. But folks, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, it turns out they've been doing some really freaky experiments and freaky experiments using things like aborted, like parts of babies, essentially, right? Babies that were aborted in the womb. Not just, you hear fetal tissues and it doesn't sound that bad. Oh, they're using fetal tissues and it's a petri dish from 20 years ago or whatever. No, they were getting like baby heads. I'm serious. Tom Fitton of Judicial Watch says that these documents he's gotten, which he got through a lawsuit from the FDA, are some of the most disturbing things he's ever seen. And the scary thing with this is that this research, this very bizarre research, and I'll get into a few different points on this very bizarre research ties into the research they were doing with these COVID, again, virus experiments, such as creating humanized mice, as they're calling them, in order to create viruses that could infect the lungs of humans. In order to basically create viruses that could infect the lungs of humans, altering viruses, they call them chimeric viruses, where they're changing them. They're doing gain of function research, something Fauci himself denied he was doing, but it turns out now that he was apparently lying about this, which we'll get into as well tonight. That in addition to creating viruses that can infect human cells, in addition to lying about this type of research, they were also using humanized mice that have lungs that have been humanized. So basically they're testing on a mice, but essentially the viruses they're using could infect humans. In addition to all of that, they were using parts of aborted infants in this, including, not just like petri dish type stuff. And so this is getting more disturbing, folks. Another quick note on this before I get into the story. Remember that it was Project Veritas with James O'Keefe, of course. They actually had this I believe it was them, at least. It was either them or Tom Fitton again, but I believe it was Project Veritas. They actually got leaks from within, I believe it was Pfizer, one of these big vaccine companies, where they found these companies were trying to cover up this information. They were trying to prevent information from going public about how they were using parts of aborted infants. Now it says here, let's get into this story. It says the Food and Drug Administration assured the Daily Caller News Foundation Friday that it has not entered into any contracts for, quote, the purchase of human fetal tissues. But there's an important caveat. They're saying they have not done it, but they just have not done it since 2008. They were doing it before that. The agency's response follows the release of documentation obtained by Judicial Watch showing that the FDA procured fetal organs, tissues, and heads for research. Again, those are aborted infants, folks. Organs, tissues, and heads of aborted infants for research that involved, quote, humanized mice. FDA, it says now, previous documents uncovered by Judicial Watch found that the FDA, it's saying here, requested fresh and never frozen fetal organs. They wanted the organs fresh and not frozen, meaning that this is like China stuff. This is like what the Chinese Communist Party is doing. This organs on demand type business. They wanted them fresh. In other words, you have to have it, basically the infant killed and then the parts transported without having to freeze it and not having it go bad, essentially in time for them to do this. Now, Tom Fitton said this. He says, I've been doing this for 23 years, getting documents from government agencies like this, and oftentimes getting very incriminating information. He says, I've been doing this for 23 years. These documents we've gotten from the FDA and our other lawsuit, they are the worst thing I've ever seen. Serious statement from Tom Fitton. Now, he said that to Daily Caller News Foundation, and he also added, the most troubling documents I've ever seen. Now, a bit further into the story, it says this. Judicial Watch obtained the communications, which spans from 2012 and 2013 through 2019, which was when they filed their Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, lawsuit against the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS. Now, on this, it says the lawsuit, and because those of you who don't know, when you file a FOIA request, essentially it's a Freedom of Information Act request. You can file them. Typically, journalists will file them, or again, in Tom Fitton's case, legal agencies will file them. And essentially, you can request data or documents from the government within certain stipulations. Documents, you have to choose the keyword. It mentions this or that keyword, and they will have to go through all of their files and provide it to you, oftentimes redacting different parts. And it's something that causes a lot of trouble for government agencies, and they have to do it. It's a bit of a headache for them, but they have to give it to you, typically. Sometimes they'll ignore it, but oftentimes they do have to give it to you. Oftentimes they'll ignore it unless you sue them, importantly, which is what Judicial Watch often does. Now, they again filed this lawsuit. They filed this FOIA request lawsuit against the Health and Human Services, Department of Health and Human Services. And it says the lawsuit asked for all communications and documents between the FDA and the human fetal tissue provider, which is called Advanced Bioscience Resources. That's a company called ABR. That's the name of it, Advanced Bioscience Resources. Again, a dealer in human baby body parts. Related to human fetal tissues intended for the use in humanized mice research. A process in which researchers implant undeveloped or underdeveloped human tissue cells into living mice. Now, this is a quote from Tom Fitton again to Daily Caller, and he says, so now the Biden FDA is defending chopping up the parts of unborn human beings to create vaccines. He says, is that their position? What they don't tell you, he continued, is that the funding was cut off under Trump. Trump cut the funding to these programs. And it was announced earlier this year that by the Biden administration that the spigot was going to be turned back on again. So this research was stopped under Trump. The Biden administration restarted this type of research. There's a lot of different parts to this to unpack. I mean, we won't go too deep into it because I want to get into Fauci before we get into the questions. But one important thing too is even the story about the idea that basically abortion is basically a for-profit business. These companies are encouraging young mothers to get abortions. They're of course having the infants torn out of their bodies. They want later and later abortions. Democrats have been talking about full-term abortions now, that's not abortion. That's killing a full-grown baby at that point. But part of the reason it seems for that is because they want fully developed human body parts, which they can sell because there's a business behind it. Remember this organization that found this, that actually did the investigative journalism on this. They called it conspiracy. They called it fake news. The people who found this were even sued by these organizations. And lo and behold, now we find that not only was this happening, not only is there a murder for profit business essentially on human infants, again, unborn infants. But folks, a lot of major government agencies and a lot of major government players have been involved in it. This is serious stuff. Disturbing stuff, but serious stuff. And on this note, too, before we get into questions, I know we're a bit late, but I want to get into this one last point on this. Dr. Anthony Fauci is now being accused of lying yet again. Because this whole thing where he was even testified before Congress and claimed that they were not financing gain-of-function research in China. Folks, it looks like they were financing gain-of-function research in China. It says here, bombshell NIH letter on bat coronavirus research reveals Fauci's big lie, a professor is saying. And it says a leading critic of the National Institutes of Health contends the federal agency put at risk U.S. health and national security by funding a bat coronavirus research project by EcoHealth Alliance. And EcoHealth Alliance was that company working with this Chinese laboratory, the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the one which in the private conversations of Fauci and others that they were trying to, it seems, prevent research into during the initial outbreak of COVID-19. Now, Richard Ebright, a professor of chemical biology at Rutgers University, told the Washington Examiner that a new letter in which the NIH conceded that the group run by Peter Daszak violated its rules when conducting bat coronavirus research is a bombshell admission because it, quote, corrects the untruthful assertions by National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Disease Director Anthony Fauci and his boss. And that's NIH Director Francis Collins, both of whom claim the NIH did not fund gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. And it seems to be the case that it's all coming out now, and it looks like, yes, they were financing gain-of-function research in Wuhan, China. The origin, again, the ground zero for COVID-19. And research which very closely fits the description of COVID-19, frankly. Check out the documentary I did over a year ago on that. You can find it on YouTube and on Epic TV, depending what you're on. That was investigating the origin of the Wuhan coronavirus. All right, folks, that said, I want to jump into some questions for the night. A couple quick notes, though. First off, we do have a newsletter now. I mentioned already that we're, again, starting up a book club, a Crossroads book club. The book for October is Debunking the 1619 Project by Mary Grabar. We have updates on that book club. You can find it in the newsletter. So check out the newsletter in the description below. Get it if you haven't already gotten it. Also, folks, we have, again, our own platform now because we're censored on YouTube, and hopefully we have a better future building our own platform, which is Epic TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. And folks, we have a lot of great shows there. I'll show you a quick trailer of one, which is interesting, talking about Christopher Steele and this whole Trump-Russia narrative, going into why Christopher Steele might have given this interview to ABC. Because, folks, the timing of it is interesting. The timing of it is interesting, folks, because now you have Durham coming out, Special Counsel John Durham, the one we all thought disappeared off the face of the earth. And, folks, when he did this recent, announced some charges on some key individuals tied to the Trump-Russia scandal, folks, he laid out essentially the case for a large conspiracy case, which many individuals may get swept up into. Let me show you a quick trailer now of that episode going into this. It's from Truth Over News, one of our other programs in Epic TV.
After 5 long years, dossier author Christopher Steele has finally emerged for a public interview with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos. Steele was portrayed as a former intelligence officer, as if he was an official representative of the British government. Steele, who left his desk job at MI6 in 2009, was actually a paid political operative of the Clinton campaign and a paid informant for the FBI. Steele, whose dossier was pivotal to establishing the Russia collusion narrative, was also employed by real-life Russian oligarchs, including Oleg Deripaska. Steele is also the subject of a recent court order requiring that Steele testify in litigation against Fusion GPS, the firm that had hired him.
All right, folks. Yeah, great episode to check out. We have a lot like it. You can find the link to that in the description below, so check it out. Again, that's epictv.com/Crossroads. That said, folks, let's jump into some questions. First of all, we have one from a Shannon Haney. Good to see you here. He said, Josh, can you give any insight into the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and how it basically removes all parental rights over their children? Will the U.S. ratify it under Brandon? Yeah, so basically it's true. The United Nations does essentially have a program looking to take away custody, not take away custody, but basically make it so that children are assets of the state, taking away essentially a lot of parental rights. This is not new. This goes back to communism. Karl Marx himself talked about, I believe it was in The Holy Family, talking about once the family is destroyed, that essentially the institutions that stem from it, basically all the capitalist systems, will be destroyed as well. This has been a long-term agenda. Now, the education system in the United States, the public school system, is heavily based on the Prussian model, which really wasn't meant to educate you. It was meant to basically teach you how to obey. The history of this is very interesting. A lot of it also pulls from the Owenite model. You can find a great series of articles on this. It's actually on Epic Times by an author named Alex Newman, AlexNewmann. If you want to learn about the history of this, it's really interesting. Again, the history of public education in the United States and around the world, as it relates to especially the Owenite model and the Prussian model. And again, it ties directly into communism and into what you're discussing with the United Nations Convention on this. That essentially, yes, the goal of it is to take away, to basically make kids assets of the state. If you want to watch a movie that, keep in mind, a lot of older movies were taking these ideas being presented as possible solutions for society, like George Orwell, 1984, like Animal Farm, like a lot of these dystopian type books were taking these ideas that communists were putting forward and imagining what they would actually look like. You can actually see a good image. Actually, it's interesting of what Marx kind of envisioned communism to look like in a lot of ways by checking out an old movie called Logan's Run, where kids are taken from their parents at birth and raised essentially by this high-tech system. And I won't get into the whole story, but it does play into that. And yes, that was something proposed by a lot of different groups, and including right now under certain organizations within the United Nations. Another question here from Dade Johnson. He said, Josh, have you heard that EcoHealth Alliance violated its terms and conditions of NIH grant number 110964? I know that EcoHealth Alliance did a lot of very unethical things. I don't know the exact number here, what it would relate to, unless you're talking about the proposal they had to the Department of Defense, or sorry, was it to one of the research branches of the Defense Department? Basically, I don't know if this is the one you're talking about, but I'll mention the one I just discussed. Basically, EcoHealth Alliance was submitting for funding for research they wanted to do in China, where they wanted to create viruses that could infect humans, put those coronaviruses, put those viruses into bats, and then release those bats into the wild in bat caves. And this happened to be in China, and I believe around the Yunnan bat cave, which you had the horseshoe bat virus, which is the one that most closely fits the description of COVID-19. I believe specifically they requested it from DARPA, which is kind of like the R&D branch of the Pentagon. And funny enough, the Pentagon denied that research because they said basically it sounds like you want to do gain-of-function research, which is illegal in the United States, which it was at the time. And they were essentially, NIH and EcoHealth Alliance, essentially financing research that was illegal in the United States, but doing it in China because they couldn't do it in the United States. It seems to be that was the case. Thomas Martin, you said, hi, Josh. Question. Why won't the Texas governor utilize the National Guard to help Texas Border Patrol if Biden won't? After all, New York governor and Biden say they will use National Guards to subsidize workers who walk out and not take the jab. That's a good question, actually. Texas is also a unique state within the United States Union because Texas also has its own military. Now, you could say technically that National Guards function as kind of the militia for the United States. Every state has its National Guard, which can be mobilized by the governor. Now, Texas is unique because they actually have their own military, in it, which is kind of different from that. And yeah, it's true that the Texas governor could technically mobilize the military if he wanted to. It's a good question on why he's not doing that. Your guess is as good as mine. He has asked other states to step in and help Texas to secure the border. Maybe he doesn't want the bad optics leading into 2022. That's possible. Remember, even having Border Patrol agents riding on horseback, and they have their whips where they have to, they use it for the horses, not to whip people, but they're trying to block people from trying to cross illegally. And I mean, it probably didn't work in the long run because you have literally hundreds of thousands of people pouring across the border right now. But a photographer took a very interestingly timed photo that it made it look like the Border Patrol agent was whipping people. And that even got high-level U.S. officials commenting on it and saying, how dare they whip people? This is like slavery all over again, even though it never happened. These are the same people who go and cry to us about disinformation and the threats of misinformation on society, themselves spreading misinformation in a way that actually harms U.S. national security. Now, it's a good question on why Governor Abbott is not mobilizing the National Guard or the Texas military in order to deal with this crisis. My only thought would be that he doesn't want the bad optics of it. And frankly, there's only so much they could probably even do, given that you have literally hundreds of thousands of people pouring across the border. And it seems to be the case as well that the Biden administration is helping facilitate a lot of that. You might have seen the recent story where Jen Psaki herself, the White House press secretary, admitted to speculative reports based on observations on the ground that it seemed like the federal government was taking people who are illegally crossing into the United States and then transporting them to different parts of the United States, such as flying them on airplanes and so on. We thought this was, there was credible reports on it. A lot of us would like to believe that our government is not engaging in what is essentially human trafficking at this point, or engaging in illegal actions. They admitted it, folks. They admitted that, yes, they have been doing this. They've been taking people, they say it's minors, but you're having people up to, I believe, 20 years old, who they're taking from the border and they're transporting to other parts of the country. They admitted that they were flying people from the border to New York, for example. And you've even had different parts of Texas under pressure that basically they would get some help from the federal government only under certain conditions, such as they don't test these people for the virus, that they don't essentially try to stop things and so on. I won't go into the details of it. It does raise some questions, though, on what does it mean when the government itself is essentially assisting in the violations of U.S. law, when the federal government itself is not preventing people from violating the law, but instead assisting them in doing so. It has pretty serious implications when you think about it, and stuff beyond probably what we even know about it, frankly, which could tie into what Governor Abbott may be basing his assessments on and why he's not taking such a strong stance as to mobilize the military or the National Guard to deal with it. On that note, briefly, though, you do have a sheriff down in Texas who's deputizing people to help deal with this crisis. One of the interesting parts about sheriffs in the United States is they're essentially elected officials, and they can deputize deputies who have the powers of the sheriff, and they're able to do a lot of things that, frankly, even local governments and federal government can't really control. Speaking of which, I'm hoping to get down to the border in Texas soon to do some reporting on this. I'll keep you all updated on that. Another question here from Cameron Bacon. He said, Josh, what search engines do you use? For the sake of the chat participants, it's been said that DuckDuckGo has several questionable red flags despite their claims to protect privacy. So currently I use DuckDuckGo and I run it on Brave browser, and I go into the settings and I alter a lot of things myself so that a lot of stuff that's normally tracked is not tracked, and I go through a few different stages to help ensure my privacy and try to at least ward off hackers. Not to say that, frankly, it probably doesn't work in the long run. It dissuades it, but maybe it doesn't work in the long run. You're absolutely right. There have been reports about DuckDuckGo having some pretty serious issues, red flags around privacy protection. And also, it seems, at least going along with some types of programs that appear to be in line with the types of censorship we're seeing on other platforms as well. It's not clear whether it's intentional or not, but there have been a lot of red flags around it. To the extent that I've also been looking for a new search engine. Unfortunately, I don't know of a good replacement just yet. Hopefully something will come about soon. And on that note, with a browser, Brave browser is decent if you like privacy. There are actually better ones. I don't want to name any off the top of my head because I want to do some research first, but I'm looking for a new one as well for myself. Quick trivia question as well. I used to be the technology editor for Epic Times for several years while I was frankly doing a lot of the investigative work as well. And I covered a lot of cybersecurity. So I tend to know about a lot of these random apps and so on because I was writing about it for several years. I will do just one more question, then I want to get into some more stories for the night. Maybe a couple more. See, this is from Audrey Shukin. He said, do you know anything about this Thomas Renz FDA lawsuit? Apparently COVID death numbers were highly inflated, but I'm having a hard time finding or verifying this. Besides Renz's website, with their CMS data. There were public articles where you had admissions. I did see articles on it. I believe Epic Times had stories on it if you want to check it out. There were stories stating that the COVID death tolls were highly inflated here in the United States. And a lot of that was based on the standards through which they were determining what constitutes a COVID death. Now, it's kind of dark humor, but bizarre as well. You might have seen this CNN article, I believe it was today or yesterday, saying that, folks, they're saying now that if you get the COVID shot, it can protect you against death from just about any means, which is bizarre if you think about it, that becoming inoculated, well, as much as it gives you protection, becoming inoculated against COVID can protect you from death by almost any means, as they're claiming. The implication of that basically is that they're conflating COVID deaths with deaths by every other means, which is the part of that story that nobody's really explaining. And that's because of the way they've been defining what a COVID death is. This is the interesting way that you have kind of like a domino effect of stories. If the original data on COVID was a person can die by many different means, and if the person had COVID in their body, it would be registered as a COVID death. That's the way a lot of it was working. What happens then when you take it that pretty much death by any means, as long as you had COVID, constitutes a COVID death, and you look at the data on people dying by any means, and suddenly they're claiming that, well, becoming immune to the vaccine protects you from death essentially by any means, which is kind of a play on words of what this report was saying. It gets a bit bizarre, but essentially that's where it's at. But on your note on this, I don't know of the lawsuit specifically from Thomas Renz, but I did see the articles, and I believe Epic Times has stories on it. And I know we've covered on this show before as well, that yes, the COVID number deaths were inflated, at least here in the United States, because of the way that they were basically keeping track of what constitutes a COVID death. That was the issue. Testing positive. You said, Josh, do you have any insight on how to prepare for hyperinflation? Well, gold or silver, frankly. You look, hard assets that typically won't be affected by inflation. Bullion, right? Some people are saying Bitcoin. I don't know. Try it if you want, but I'd say Bitcoin is unstable because of the way that China and different centralized banks are trying to manage it right now. They're trying to essentially get rid of cryptocurrency in China. And because, again, they're rolling out the digital yuan, the Chinese Communist Party is promoting this as a global model. And as a way to track transactions, folks, they're trying to get rid of that. Now, you might think that might not come to the United States, but remember what they're talking about with the ability to track transactions over $600. They can even track your bank account if you make transactions over $600. They want to be able to track transactions, and what is untrackable typically as it relates to you as an individual. Well, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, which has me wonder whether they're planning to regulate it, which they have been talking about doing. So long story short, if you want to have an asset that's typically not affected by inflation too much, I would say gold or silver personally. And this isn't a plug for my normal advertiser, just so you know, this is just a general answer on that. All right, folks, that said, let's go into some more stories for the night, because it's a little more I want to talk about. Now, you might remember this recent story we were discussing where essentially one of the big school boards in the United States, I mean a big one, I believe 90,000-ish members, was unhappy because parents were criticizing them. They were criticizing them for, again, critical race theory education being taught to the kids, criticizing them over the wild gender theories being taught to kids, criticizing them because they don't want their kids to have to wear masks in school because Petri dish tests have shown the amount of diseases and things carried on the masks when you're not washing them regularly, to the point where you could get sick from the mask itself if you're not changing it on a regular basis or washing it on a regular basis, which a lot of kids don't. And also because they don't agree with things like the potential vaccine mandates, which I should note they have now approved partially through Pfizer for children ages 5 to 11. It has now happened, and we'll see what the implications of that are. Now, this National School Board Association, looking at parents who were unhappy about what was being taught to kids, essentially went to the federal government and asked the Biden administration itself to investigate the parents, possibly as domestic terrorists, for criticizing them or threatening them because they're unhappy with what's being taught to kids. Interesting now, it seems this organization has folded to pressure from parents, as has the Attorney General, from the social pressure arising over this. This has some broad implications beyond even the story itself, which I'll get into. But let me explain the story first. It says National School Boards Association apologizes over letter comparing parents to domestic terrorists. It says the National School Boards Association, or NSBA, has apologized to its members on Friday for a letter that was previously sent to the Biden administration in which the school board group compared parents accused of trying to intimidate educators to domestic terrorists. In a memo issued to NSBA members, the board said that on behalf of NSBA, we regret and apologize for the letter, which was sent on September 29th, urging President Joe Biden to take action to stop what it described as, quote, threats and acts of violence against school boards, teachers, and others involved in the public education sphere. And they're clarifying this now. They're saying there was no justification for some of the language included in the letter. We should have a better process in place to allow for consultation on the communication of this significance. We apologize also for the strain and stress the situation has caused to you and your organizations. And it added as well, the NSBA, again, the National School Boards Association, deeply values not only the work of local school boards that make important contributions within our communities, but also the voices of parents who should and must continue to be heard when it comes to decisions about their children's education, health, and safety. And also, in addition to the school board apologizing, Attorney General Merrick Garland, who was the one who answered this and suggested they may in fact start investigating parents, they are also saying now, they're kind of walking it back. And they're saying now that this domestic terrorist letter from the school board is what launched their probe into this. And it says here, Attorney General Merrick Garland opened an investigation on October 4th into violence against educators, declaring that there had been disturbing spikes in threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff in recent months. Normally, folks, you'd call the police if that happened, not ask the president himself and the Attorney General to investigate them as domestic terrorists. Right? Normally, you'd go after one parent if they make death threats. Fair enough. Not going after parents in general to protect an organization that's under criticism because people don't agree with what it's doing. Now, on this note, it says, according to information revealed on October 21st during a House Committee on the Judiciary Oversight hearing, Garland, the Attorney General, his assertion of a disturbing spike was based not on law enforcement intelligence or academic studies. In other words, he was saying there's a disturbing spike. There's a disturbing spike, folks, in threats of violence against school administrators, board members, teachers, and staff in recent months. There's a disturbing spike in it, and all the media picked it up. Turns out, folks, that disturbing spike data did not come from law enforcement, did not come from anything that was having to do with a federal investigation or police investigation. You know where it came from? It wasn't even academic studies, not even an organization like a think tank looking into. You know where it came from? It came from that school board. It was the National School Boards Association that made that claim. And the Attorney General, using only data from this group that was claiming itself a victim, using only that data, launched a domestic terrorism probe into parents. Now, anyways, wild stuff. The interesting thing with this, though, beyond the story itself, is that both the Attorney General and the school board have backed off. Both of them have backed off of this push. And this is essentially not just the Biden administration walking it back, the Attorney General in this case, over something they may be interested in actually doing, which is targeting parents who are unhappy with what's being taught to their kids under one of the main drives of government policy right now, namely mask mandates, vaccine mandates, and critical race theory, this racist education being taught to kids, this divisive Marxist racist education being taught to kids that parents oftentimes disagree with. Not only is it them basically getting this organization to walk back, not only is it them getting the school board to walk it back, the big thing with this is it was done despite, I'd say, large-scale censorship. It was done despite large-scale censorship on social media. It was done despite parents being threatened if they dare to speak out. It was done by essentially a media landscape where there are very few voices, maybe other than the one you're watching, and a handful of other media organizations that were actually even talking about it and explaining what's happening. But despite that censorship, despite the limited number of voices able to even speak about it, it had the effect, folks, of getting this very large organization and the Biden administration and the Attorney General to step back and say, hey, we didn't mean it. It was bad data. I'm sorry. Please forgive us. Now, take that into account on the power of, open debate and open ridicule, of open investigation, even not done in a highly public way because of the social media landscape we're in right now, where getting information out is actually very difficult. Even the show you're watching right now, we talk about it, but we're also heavily censored. Even despite all of that, the voices of the parents and the voices of the American people, even though not heard on a large scale amongst ourselves because of the, again, environment of censorship, had the effect of essentially getting these big organizations to not only walk back that push, but to apologize for it. Now, what's going to happen, take that into account, what's going to happen when, in addition to this level of social pressure, angry parents, of people unhappy with what's being taught to their kids, of people not willing to be silenced, even under threats of being called a domestic terrorist in this case, when despite all of that, people are able to push back and speak openly, what's going to happen when once again they have a platform on which to do it? This is going to be the interesting picture that comes about once the Trump social media is released. And the beta stage of that is going to be, this coming month in November. In fact, you can already pre-download it on your phone and sign up for the beta. Again, initial stage November. They're saying first quarter of 2022, after December, of course, that they're going to be rolling out on a larger scale. Now, we'll see how this platform actually works. We'll see if it serves the purpose, which I think a lot of people are anticipating it might serve. But folks, being able to have people again discuss without the threat of censorship is going to allow incidents like this to happen on a much larger scale. And we're going to be able to see, I think, on a much larger scale now, what people really think about some of these policies, what people really think about what's being taught to their kids, what people really think about, for example, possible remedies to viruses that we can't discuss on social media, and other things like this that are not being censored by government, but are being censored by private businesses, but through extension of that, because they're so powerful, that essentially it's affecting the entire social landscape, that we can't talk to each other directly without fear of censorship. We're going to see very soon, folks, what this country looks like once that veil of censorship is lifted. Again, and we'll see whether the Trump social media meets expectations on that, but very soon we could see. All right, folks, always a lot to talk about, but it's getting late, so we'll call it a night here. Again, I do these lives every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday, 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. I have a lot of other stuff in the works. Hopefully, a lot of it I can't wait to tell you about, hopefully soon. In addition to that, I'm also hoping to get to the U.S.-Mexico border very soon to do some on-the-ground reporting, which I'll be keeping you updated on. A lot going on, always a lot to talk about. And folks, as always, it's a real pleasure having you here. Stick around. I want to show you a quick trailer at the end of this video. We actually have an interesting episode on Epic TV about how vaccine victims get silent treatment and how doctors are risking everything they have to oppose the vaccine mandates. Part of the story you're not being told. It's one of our shows called The Nation Speaks. It's on Epic TV, epochtv.com/Crossroads. I'll show you a trailer of that at the end of this video. And folks, you can find a link to Epic TV in the description below. But folks, as always a pleasure. Thank you for being here. That said, please take care of yourselves, stay informed, and stay free. Thank you.
In this episode of The Nation Speaks, it's taboo to say, but some people do have a bad reaction to the jab. So what's being done about it? Very little, according to Super Bowl champion Ken Rutgers, whose wife suffered a life-altering injury after her dose of Moderna.
We naively thought that all we needed to do is let them know that these conditions existed, and certainly they would want to study these folks and try to find a remedy.
And on America Q&A, we ask if people should get fired for not being vaccinated if they have natural immunity.
We do have natural immunity, but this thing is unknown.
Any enforcement of it would be very immoral.
I had bad reaction on my muscles and it went away, thank God. What happened if it wouldn't?
There could be other penalties, but I don't think they should lose their jobs. Yeah.
Next, a California doctor willing to lose everything to fight for medical freedom. Dr. Christopher Rake explains why.
There are things that are more important to me than my comfort, than my salary, than a house, than a car, and all these things. And that is my freedom. Because if you don't have freedom, you can't have all those things.
Finally, in our second America Q&A, are rising food and gas prices affecting you?
You see it every time I go in the grocery store.
I switched from a car to a scooter.
At this time, we would be able to afford the increase in price.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. It affects everybody.
I mean, yeah, everything's getting pretty expensive.
Be sure to watch the entire episode, now available exclusively at epochtv.com, a new completely censorship-free premium subscription platform. Brought to you by the Epoch Times. See you there.